Imposter syndrome doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're growing.
Hello and welcome to the unofficial SFCC podcast. I'm Steve Holsinger, your host. Today, we do not have Kyle Montgomery as he is off doing founder things for Generous, but our guest today is Angelia Sterling. Angela, welcome.
Hi, glad to be here.
Today, our intended topics, which we'll probably, veer off from at some point, are women working in tech and imposter syndrome as our general guidelines. But let's start by doing a little bit of an introduction for those who maybe haven't come across you yet.
So I have been working in e-commerce for the bulk of my career. I actually started in software engineering, but quickly shifted to e-commerce and got my feet wet with Demandware, Commerce Cloud at Burton Snowboards. We were actually one of the first 5 brands that launched on it. So it's a pretty exciting time to be working there. And since then, I've kind of worked brand side, I've worked SI side, even did a stint at Salesforce. And so kind of culminated all of that into doing some consulting now.
Awesome. Is that going well?
It is, yeah. It's been an interesting change, but it's really nice to be able to partner with brands a little bit more directly, and with it being sort of more on a fractional contract basis, I get to influence them a little bit more in ways that I think being SI side is a little harder to do. So it's kind of a really great mix of the two.
I imagine you probably also have more power in choosing who you want to work with as opposed to being in an SI.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, because at an SI, you're kind of handed the projects. So at the moment, I'm working with 2 of my favorite brands. So pretty excited to be able to do that. But yeah, it's been a great change.
Awesome. With regard to your job experience, you've posted on LinkedIn about this a few times, but let's open up with, I guess, your experience working as a woman in a largely male-dominated field. Um, I have long been paying attention to this issue both as an employee and how I interact with women in the office, but also as a partner in a company at one point where I recognize we need to be considerate and thoughtful about hiring obviously, but also B, how we interact with each other. Because I think that often you end up with pockets of men who are used to talking to each other and they don't consider how the way they interact affects other people.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting. I think it's probably been the last few years that I feel like I've really kind of started to notice the difference, which kind of makes me think one of the posts I saw recently was talking about how women in tech kind of drop off the older you get. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I have obviously noticed that I am very frequently one of the only women in the room or the only woman in the room, especially from a tech perspective. But I think as far as how it's influenced my career, I haven't noticed quite so much until recently. I think kind of looking back on it, I've never had a tech female leader. I've had female leaders, but not tech female leaders. And so I think for me in particular, I never really saw myself there. I think because, it's interesting, you see a lot of people saying you need to see yourself in these roles or these positions in order to kind of aspire to it, especially as kids. And it's kind of weird looking back on it to see that it did kind of have that impact on me. So yeah, it's been interesting. And then, I think what I was sort of alluding to is it's interesting this report that I was seeing was talking about how women enter tech about the same rate as men, but the older that we get, the more frequently that women exit, which I think is probably lends itself to why we don't see a lot of women in the leadership roles in the tech industry, because they're moving on and going on to something else. And it's interesting, I haven't seen anything that really talks about why that happens, but yeah, something that I hope we can kind of correct and change.
I'm sure we could hypothesize all day long what some of the causes of that are. I imagine one major contributor might be the desire to start a family, which is hard to balance with especially as you progress your career, it becomes more and more demanding often of your time, and your ability to manage your time and hold boundaries is a huge thing that I think everybody needs, obviously, but it's harder when you have children because often their schedule does not align with your work schedule and they need to go places and do things, and that can be challenging.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of truth in that. And, I saw a post recently or a comment that somebody had made. It was a man, not to call him out, but he said something along the lines of the tech industry isn't made for women and that's why it doesn't work for women. And we see women dropping off. And I think it's kind of disheartening to hear something like that because, he was talking about how he works 60-hour weeks or 80-hour weeks and sometimes has to work 30-hour days or have these expectations. And certainly I've had all of those exact same expectations on me, and I've been through all of that. So, I look at a comment like that and I think, well, I was able to do it and have a family. So there is a way to make it happen. And I think a lot of it is I've had a really great network of people supporting me. My husband, my kids have been very supportive. My family has been very supportive to step in when my husband can't take the kids for some reason, and I need to put in a 30-hour day to launch a site or whatever. So I think there's a lot of that, and I've had the fortune of working for companies and had coworkers that are willing to step in and help out when I can't. And I think it goes both ways. But I think when we have this sort of expectation that parenting rests solely on the mom, it is hard to overcome those boundaries that we have. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think family probably is a big part of it with women exiting the industry, but I don't think it needs to be, and I don't think it should be.
Yeah, there's certainly a important role that your partner plays in balancing those requirements of your life and supporting you in what you want to be doing with your life, which is contrary to like the kind of historical norms, not being a person that just has babies and raises children. So I certainly understand that perspective. And I think as someone who has gone through all of those like extreme demands on your time, and I have done so with children the entire time, it was entirely enabled by my partner being willing to, be that person for our family. That has worked out fine for us, but I understand that that's not, what everybody wants out of life. And my own partner, in fact, is now, trying to kind of break free of that and get back into the workforce, which ultimately she really never entered because we had started a family so early.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think one other thing I wonder about, and maybe this is just like conjecture or, maybe my male like perspective, but do you think women are leaving because of how they're treated?
I mean, that's an excellent question. I'm sure there's probably some of that. I know early in my career have been subject to, being talked over or not necessarily being seen as an authority. And it is hard, right? And I think it's a muscle you need to kind of train to sort of push back and try to make sure that you're being heard. So, yeah, I think there definitely probably is some of that. It is a little bit of a boys' club for sure. I think for me, I grew up playing mostly with boys and hanging out. A lot of my best friends were boys. So for me, it's not uncomfortable, but I can definitely appreciate for some people who really sort of crave that female interaction that it's hard not understanding more sort of where men are coming from.
I have personally witnessed the sort of like speaking over, and frankly, I struggle with like I have ADHD and I want to get like, I don't want to lose my thoughts. So like sometimes I'll interject when I really shouldn't because I'm so afraid of not remembering to put this thing that I think is important into the conversation. But at the same time, I'm cognizant of the fact that there's a trend where women were less likely to speak up in meetings, less likely to, bring forth their ideas. And so I usually try to invite it like explicitly, and that goes for people who I notice who are just introverts in general and are less likely to, provide their opinions anyway. They still have valuable input to provide and perspectives that maybe the rest of us don't have. And I think that's something that anybody in any leadership position should be doing, regardless of gender or who their team is.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think and yeah, I would classify myself as a I don't know, on the introvert scale somewhere. I'm not always stuck in my room, but definitely crave the alone time as well. And you're right. I think that in combination of being a woman. So for me, and maybe that's part of it too. For me, I think because feeling like I'm an introvert and feeling like okay, I'm not necessarily always comfortable to speak out anyway, especially in larger groups. sort of seems like my personality and not necessarily because I'm a woman, right? So for me, I definitely communicate better over email. So, I think feeling like you have the ability to follow up, right? Or you're asked questions later even for your opinion. And I think that is a good way to try to draw some people into the conversation too. I think also I've noticed, so I've been remote for like most of my career. And it's been really interesting to me. Most of the positions I had, I was off camera because that's kind of just how the dev team works and definitely appreciate it. But at one of my previous companies, there was a camera on policy during meetings. And it's interesting the difference that that makes. And I think just seeing that somebody looks like they're about to say something makes it a lot more likely that they're going to be heard as opposed to, again, somebody who's just kind of steamrolling the conversation for better or worse, whether they mean to or not, they don't notice, especially with the cameras off. And so I have found that to be really interesting. And it's something that I've kind of carried forward into all of my roles is just to try to keep my camera on, even when, more than 50% of the people maybe don't have it on, just so you can see if I want to say something.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges with that where, latency is a problem. If you're waiting for that break and you think you've found it, but the person in the room has just started speaking before your message gets to the other end of the world or whatever, that's problematic. I think some of this comes down to confidence too, which is a good segue, I think, to bring us to the imposter syndrome topic that we wanted to cover. I'm curious, what do you think drives imposter syndrome for you and maybe overall?
Yeah, syndrome has been really interesting. I posted a quote that I read recently that really resonated with me. It said, "Imposter syndrome doesn't mean you're failing; it means you're growing." And I wish that I had read that so much sooner in my career because I think that reframing would have changed how I approached a lot of things. For me, I always feel that when I'm applying for a new job or when I've stepped into a new role, and or maybe sometimes it even keeps me from applying for a role, right? Like, I don't have that qualification or that title's above me. Sometimes I think is a lot of the things that I've thought about before taking on a new role. And so having this reframing and looking at it differently where it's more about growing and changing and adapting. Like nobody expects you to come in day one, right? And know everything. I think it's hard to accept that and not think I need to nail this as soon as I walk in the door. But certainly I have succeeded at all these new roles that I've taken on. And I think more people need to be willing to do that too and not think of themselves sort of stuck in the role that they're in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, we worked together a long time ago, and I remember that was about when you were making the transition into the, like, architecture role. Architecture role means something different in other various companies, but in that role, it was largely documentation, solution engineering, that sort of stuff. And so you're right, you have succeeded throughout, like, all of those transitions. And something that's interesting that I've read previously and is backed up by a lot of studies is that women tend to wait until they have 100% of the qualifications in a job description to apply, whereas men are generally willing to apply to anything that they're like mostly qualified for. So if there are any ladies listening that are considering not to hit the apply button on something that they're like 85% qualified for, just do it. What's the worst that could happen?
Well, I mean,
Yeah, what are your
realistically,
thoughts on that?
unless you're shifting from one role to another that's almost nearly identical, there's always going to be things that, you don't tick the box on. So I think you're right. I think I've always had that sort of expectation of myself that, okay, I don't have this one skill that they're looking for, or I don't have the number of years of experience that they're looking for. I mean, even a lot of the jobs that I've gotten haven't been because I've gone out looking for them. It's because they've come to me. I think, yeah, women definitely need to probably take that advice from men and be willing to put themselves out there more.
Awesome. I know I'll have to probably put links to this in the like show notes or whatever, but there are groups that operate to help support women uh, entering or re-entering the tech space. And in particular, there's one that focuses on Salesforce community and careers. So I'll share that in the notes later. But what do you think people should be considering whenever, obviously the reframing of imposter syndrome as like, this is growth as opposed to like fear is growth, right? Like anytime you're afraid or, nervous, generally that means you are doing something that you're slightly uncomfortable with, or is a new area or a new way of applying a skill that you have. And you mentioned reframing. I'm huge in, wellness and personal, development, and reframing that fear into excitement has shown in a lot of studies to improve, the way that you approach problems. And if you just tell yourself, I'm excited because this is new, you may be more comfortable stepping into that role or that conversation or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw something very similar about that recently where I think they did some sort of study where they sent people into a room, introverts, I think specifically, into a room, and they had some of them tell themselves they were nervous. And they had some of them tell themselves that they were excited. And the ones that were excited or told themselves they were excited, even if that feeling was still that nervous fear feeling, were more likely to go have good conversations and walk away feeling good about the experience versus the people who felt negative going in came out feeling negative because that's kind of what you're telling yourself. So yeah, it's interesting, I guess, how our brains kind of interpret that feeling. It is the same feeling, right? That, butterflies in the stomach, nervous, exciting. So yeah, it's interesting that you can tell yourself that you feel something different than you do, but seems important.
Yeah. I personally have struggled with like negative self speak for most of my life and think the power of how you talk to yourself about yourself is nearly limitless. I think we've as a species have kind of like only scratched the surface of what we're capable of when it comes to the power of our thoughts and our words. People, go about their lives with imposter syndrome. I feel like there's usually a point where they no longer feel that way, or at least in the role they're in, they may,
Yeah.
reach a point where they no longer feel that way. What do you think is the key driver of like overcoming and what would you name that?
I know you mentioned confidence earlier, and I think a lot of it kind of comes back to that. I know for me personally, it's usually been, I'm stepping into this new role. I don't know if I'm qualified. I feel like everybody's smarter than me, but then getting in there and actually realizing I'm just as smart as these people. I'm doing just as good of a job as they are. So I think a lot of it is just having that experience and understanding, or even like an opportunity to grow. Like certainly I've had jobs too where I've stepped into the role and I don't feel like I am qualified, but I'm given the opportunity and the time and the space to learn, right? Like again, nobody I think is expecting you to come in with what 100% of the qualifications nailed, right? So, certainly I've never expected that of other people, right? I've never expected them to know everything on day one. So I think giving yourself that time and space to explore and learn and grow into that, but also accepting that maybe you know more than you think you do. It's funny. It does seem like it's so hard to get over, but it's like that first step. Like if you don't take it, you're never going to get that opportunity. It's really weird that we have to live with this uncomfortable feeling in order to be better, but I think it's something you have to accept in order to move on in your career to something better.
Yeah, I've kind of vacillated in my work experience between feeling like I'm the least qualified to like I'm the most qualified in the room. And I'd rather be in the I'm the least qualified in the room because that means I have a lot more opportunities to learn and grow. How do you feel about that?
I know that's a position I've always been uncomfortable putting myself in being the least qualified. I definitely have really respected learning from people. And I feel like every time I have moved to a new position, I get that. I always get to learn something new, which I think is amazing. I was really thrilled also to be able to work and be that person to other people. I think being a manager allowed me to understand from somebody else's perspective what they need. So like I guess even that was a huge growth for me, not having managed people before and stepping into this role where I have to learn those skills. And it's so different seeing it from the other side.
Yeah. Do you think vulnerability comes into play in any of that?
It's interesting. I feel like, talking about women, vulnerability to me seems sort of like something I feel like would be attached to a woman. I don't know. Do you feel vulnerable when you step into something that you don't know?
Well, I think there's like an intimidation, but what I've learned is you often don't know how much you're valued because people are less likely to tell you.
Mhm.
And I had one in particular scenario where I had given my 2 weeks notice and the company set up like a last day hangout phone call where everybody that wanted to join and see me off came to talk to me and chat with me and stuff. And during that call, literally the last day I was working for this company, people started saying things to me about how much they valued my contributions and my existence. And from that point forward, I recognized that, like, as a society in general, but also with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, we all need to be more vulnerable with each other and actually like speak from the heart, because you think this person knows how much they mean to you, but unless you've told them, they probably don't. And they might even think that you don't value them at all because you've never said it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, something that I experienced when I was managing was, and this kind of came from my own experiences, right? When I stepped into this role and I didn't really know exactly what managing people meant, all I had to do was look at the people that had managed me for how I wanted to be, right? Some of the good things, some of the bad things. What do I want to do? What do I definitely not want to do? And so, to your point, one of the things that I noticed that I really valued throughout my career was when my managers told me how I was doing, right? I had one particular manager really early in my career. So, in my mind, I'm still, in my early 20s, I'm young, I'm still learning. And I had a new manager step in and tell me, um, I'm giving you this 30% raise because you're underpaid and you're doing just as well as everybody else. And so it completely shifted how I saw myself and how I was performing at my job. And so again, kind of leaned on that experience of how do I want to treat my people. And so I tried to probably over communicate how I thought they were doing. And I was sort of floored that it meant as much as it did to them, because even if they were senior developers, right? Even the senior developers did not see themselves as senior developers. And I obviously have gone through the same thing. Like, I don't know how you know when you've sort of crossed the line to becoming an expert in what you're doing, but you don't see it in yourself. And if somebody's not telling you that, you never know, right? You kind of go on under the expectation or assumption that you're less than you are.
I think part of it is you've decided that you've made it, right? But conventional wisdom would say 10,000 hours is what you need to invest to become an expert in something. And I guarantee the people putting in those 60-hour weeks and, 30-hour days, which is technically 1.5 days, are more likely to have reached that point earlier in their career than folks who, clock in, clock out 9 to 5.
Yeah.
Where do you think confidence ultimately comes from?
I kind of feel like it comes from failing, to be honest. I think the more you fail, the more opportunities you have to figure out how to do something right. I feel like I should like quote that somewhere. That's
Write
pretty
that
good.
down somewhere. Yeah. Yeah, I think that goes along with the vulnerability a little bit, because like if you are encouraged to take small risks and, fail fast, as you've pointed out, yeah, you learn so much more from failing than you do from succeeding.
Yeah.
And I have, just by virtue of having enough projects and, employers and stuff in my career to have, I think, accelerated some of that for myself. But, the vulnerability to say, I screwed up, but here's what I learned and here's how I'm going to fix it is huge. But also, to your point earlier, the vulnerability to say, I'm uncomfortable with this assignment because I've never done it before, or I'm worried that like my ability to do this one aspect of that thing isn't where it needs to be, would ultimately get you probably support that you need if you were willing to voice that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember early in my career, I sort of had these like focus areas of what I was helping develop. And I remember being handed like the product detail page and it was going to become my project. And I'm like, whoa, I'm not ready for this. Right. Like that's a whole thing. Now I'm responsible for this entire page and it's consumer facing. And I was terrified. I was honestly terrified. But I think you're right. One of my favorite things about our industry is how supportive I think everybody is, which is probably one of those reasons why I don't feel like, I have this stark, like I'm working with men and it's different and it's weird because they've always been so supportive of working together. And so anytime I've reached out or I've needed help, my colleagues have always been super amazing at supporting me. And I think that's one of the great things about our community. But you're talking about failing, and I think you're right. Like, times we have these big projects or we push something to production and it, breaks something and we feel like these massive failures. I think it's interesting, even just from a small scale, as developers, we're constantly wrong, right? We write code that doesn't work right. And that's our job every day. And it's interesting how we go through this development process, right? Of, maybe we think something's going to take a day, it takes 2 days, it takes 3 days, and we keep not getting it, right? All of those sort of compound, and to your point, I think lead to us becoming a bit more expert in how we're writing code. But yeah, I think we have that opportunity to keep learning from our failures and keep growing.
Developers are notoriously bad at estimating, so that's probably one of the areas we fail at the most. One thing that I really have enjoyed in the developer journey that I've gone through was doing test-driven development, where you write the failing test first, and then you work towards making the test succeed.
I have sadly never had the opportunity to write any tests, but I do feel like there's a lot of value in that. And yeah, that's interesting to write the failure state first. I wish a lot of times companies could slow down a little bit to invest more time in that kind of stuff because I agree. I think it would have a lot of value.
Yeah. Ironically, that experience for me was not through slowing down. It was
Yeah,
actually to try and accelerate a project because we knew we weren't going to have contracts in place to access a system's APIs until like a month after development was supposed to start. So I wrote an interface or like basically developed the software against just the API specs and then wasn't really able to test it for real until I had already finished writing it all.
that's
And
interesting.
because I wrote the failing tests and I, set up the mocks appropriately for success and failure states, it just worked. There were very few bugs. I was amazed. And it was GSI's interface. I don't know if you remember working with GSI, but that was challenging.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because a lot of times I think when we're testing, we're not testing for those failure states. So yeah, that's awesome.
Well, if I can take anything away from our conversation today, it's that failing's good. I guess I've been overly critical of the industry in how it treats women and fails to support them, but I'm very happy to hear that your experience was not that.
Yeah, I certainly can't speak for all women. I have found things to be successful for me. So I'm fortunate that I don't have a lot to complain about. I wish things had been a little bit easier. I think for me in some ways, and I think a lot of it kind of maybe also goes back to imposter syndrome, but I feel like my career path has been a little bit slower, maybe because I haven't pushed it quite as fast as other people, but
Is that intentional?
I would not say it was intentional. I think, like a lot of people, sometimes you get comfortable in one role and you kind of just stay there and you don't really think about yourself in another position. And I feel like the last 5 years or so of my career, that's changed a bit for me. But now I feel like I'm finally in that point of pushing and moving forward. Whereas for a really long time, I was just very happy doing what I was doing. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it stunts your growth in some ways.
It can. Yeah. Certainly I think there's financial implications for kind of like treading water in a certain role for a while.
Yeah,
I have struggled through the transition from like developer, architect, practice leader, director, whatever. And the biggest challenge was going from individual contributor roles to manager roles. And one of the things that really helped me was actually like I was kind of at the time into LARPing in airsoft, which is weird. It's my nerdy little side quest, but through that, I learned a little bit about certain military doctrine, which is frankly, some of the best leadership guidance you can acquire is actually derived from experiences trying to lead humans through really challenging stuff in the military.
sure.
But the thing that helped me the most was thinking of myself as a force multiplier. Like, how do I help my team be more effective individually. Because I used to measure my output by like what I could produce directly. And when you shift to a manager role, you no longer have a really good way of measuring your own success as a person in that role. And so I had to like really accept and own the fact that I'm no longer in control, first of all. And secondly, the output that I produce that's valuable is how I support and how I guide my team in growth and their own successes.
Yeah, I'd be interested to read some of that military guidance. I actually had the really big fortune of getting to take a leadership class through my company when I was a manager, and I just found it so interesting to learn how to be a manager, but also I learned so much about myself and how I was actually kind of overstepping my role, or I guess a better way to phrase it is she said, managers, and especially at my company, she said we quote unquote wear the cape, right? In that we try to be the hero all the time, right? And after I took a step back and looked at it, I realized, okay, I'm architecting solutions because I feel like I'm giving them a leg up, right? But all at the end of the day was really doing was stunting their growth, right? It's not that I thought that my people weren't capable of doing it. I literally thought I was helping, and in some ways probably was. But going back to that whole, you got to let people fail, right? You got to give them the space to learn and grow too, or they're not going to either. And once I finally took that step back, I was really astounded at how quickly the people on my team all stepped up, right? The people that were now architecting their own solutions and had less time to do development meant that the people that were, not as senior developers were developing better quality code because now they had to sort of struggle through these things themselves. And, I would have sort of expected it to be this longer challenge of, okay, all of a sudden we're going to be producing less, right? Because people are trying new things, but it actually really kind of turned out to be the opposite. We started producing more because they leveled up, right?
They had to, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think there's a parallel to parenting here. A term has come out recently called like bulldozer parenting, where you kind of remove all obstacles for your children because you want them to have a good life, you want them to be able to succeed and all that. But it's through the challenge and through the problems that you face that you grow. And so by removing all of those obstacles, you have effectively actually stunted your own child's growth.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I feel like we see a lot that kids coming up now are don't understand how to fail. And it's something that I constantly try to, work on with both of my kids because my daughter is every bit the overachiever that I am. And so, anything less than 100 means she failed. And trying to give her the grace to understand, like, you're not always going to get 100 and it's not always going to be easy and it's not supposed to be. I think it's a lesson that we all need to learn.
Well said. I'd like to close a little bit with a conversation that's related to another LinkedIn post that you recently shared, which was about how one of your children is considering school now and computer science in particular. But you also pointed out that you don't have a comp sci degree. And from my perspective, I've worked with a lot of people who have been really talented software developers that had no formal training in the field. What's your take on that?
Well, I actually didn't start in the IT industry. I did actually end up graduating with an IT degree. So not computer science light, as my brother told me, but because he has a comp sci degree. But I'll take it anyway. But yeah, you're right, and it is something that I've witnessed frequently in my career. A lot of the most talented developers that I've worked with come from various backgrounds. I've worked with some that went to school to be lawyers and decided that lawyering wasn't for them. Or I think I posted that a lot of people, interestingly, have come from like creative backgrounds with art, or I think somebody I worked with had a literature degree. And so it's interesting to me that this is such a self-taught skill, right? And I think that's something that we see with kids who get into it. I mean, they're self-taught. They don't have formal training either. And so I'm sort of surprised that it hasn't become more of a trade. I feel like 5 or 10 years ago, there was talks of it being more of a trade school type of role. But it's interesting. I was just listening to an interview that I don't know if you saw it, but, a colleague posted an interview from the New York Times that was talking about how there is sort of this overabundance of people coming out with technology degrees because of the push that there was, you know, 15 years ago or so to get more people into it. Now we have too many. So it's interesting to see where that's all gonna shift and change. It does sort of make it a really hard conversation, like, is it a valuable skill to have anymore for my son? Is it worth spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars if it's something that you can teach to yourself and do? I think having the degree is gonna help you get the job, so there's always that trade-off that you're trying to make, but, um, I also think that New York Times interview is making it sound a little bit more dire than it was. I think it was a 6% unemployment rate coming out of college, which is, I guess, worse than other degrees, but still not astounding. It's not 50% of the people coming out can't find a job. I think it is also something we're kind of seeing across the industry, right? It's not even just it's college students, it's all of us. All of us are in a position where it's a bit harder now to get these jobs.
Definitely. And I think that there was this, to your point, yes, there's been a societal like push to go that route because people saw it as a lucrative career path, or there was tons of growth in that area for a long time. One of the kind of key drivers of growth, I think, in the job market within the last 10 years was COVID, actually. The number of positions ballooned for about 2 years there. And now we're seeing actually this like kind of mass retraction from the market where those jobs are no longer available. And to your point, we have a surplus of people with this training and experience that frankly are struggling quite a lot now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's close with what's your favorite audiobook, or what audiobook are you currently reading or listening to, I guess is the right way to say that.
Let's see. Right now, so I'm reading a book called Women in Tech.
How
I did
ironic.
I know. It's interesting. All of a sudden, these women technology books have come up. I'm actually usually more of a fiction fan, but I've had these two books. So one of them is called Women in Tech, which is written or has a lot of interviews from women from leading tech companies. And then another one I recently listened to the audiobook for was called This Isn't Working. They're very similar books. They both have a lot of statistical information sort of backing up why the tech industry doesn't really work super well for women. And kind of goes back to all of those things that we were talking about earlier. But it's it's really interesting to read the statistics. I feel like it sort of backs up a lot of what you see and what maybe you don't even see, but you feel.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We'll put links to those books in the description as well. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, do you welcome that? How can they find
Absolutely.
you?
Yeah, no, I love making new connections. My new foray into posting on LinkedIn has led to a lot of that, and it's been great connecting with some new people. So absolutely feel free to reach out.
Right, we'll share your LinkedIn link in the description as well. Thank you for joining me today, Angela. It's been good talking to you and seeing you again.
Yeah,
I
you
hope
too.
you have a great day.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, you too. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll catch you next time.